What if the galaxy's deadliest being wasn't feared, but finally understood? They called her a weapon, a goddess of extinction. No one who looked upon her true form ever lived to speak of it until him. A broken soldier, a mortal, a man who didn't kneel, but chose to stay. And when he touched her gently, fearlessly, he shattered 1,000 years of hatred. Because in that moment, the war didn't end with fire. It ended with a gaze that dared to see her for what she truly was. Now, as the stars hold their breath, the galaxy must ask, if peace begins not with power, but with understanding, then how much truth can a single human heart survive? Stay with us. What happens next will change everything. The air held its breath. Smoke curled like dying spirits across the scorched valley, and from the fractured bones of once mighty machines, wind whispered secrets in languages no longer spoken. Charred banners fluttered on broken poles, their symbols unrecognizable beneath layers of ash. Somewhere, deep beneath the ruin, the planet groaned a low, ancient sound, as if the soil itself had grown tired of drinking blood. He stood alone in that silence. Elias Ward, a man once armored, now stripped by war. The plating on his chest had shattered hours ago. Dried blood painted the hollows of his collarbones. His right leg dragged like dead weight. No weapon, no squad, no backup. Just the sound of his own heartbeat slow, stubborn, and the dull, pulsing ache in his ribs where something inside had torn loose. Then the temperature shifted. It wasn't cold or warm. It was presence like gravity bending. He looked up through the rising mist, and there she was, stepping from the haze with a grace that defied the violence of this place. Her silhouette was humanoid, but only in the way a sculpture of starlight might resemble a woman. She moved like liquid thought. Every inch of her shimmered with shifting constellations, her skin glowing faintly like ink mixed with galaxies. Seraphine. The name wasn't spoken, it bloomed in his mind, uninvited and absolute. She was taller than him by at least a head, her indigo eyes vast and depthless. They weren't just looking at him, they were reading through him, past bone and memory. He didn't rise. He couldn't. Instead, Elias lowered to one knee, not in surrender but in exhaustion, the cracked ground biting into his skin. You shouldn't have come, she said, her voice smooth, crystalline, almost sad. I didn't come to win, he murmured, forcing the words through cracked lips. Just to end it. She tilted her head, curious, almost human. You think you have that power? I think I have the will, he answered. That's something. A pause hung heavy between them, stretched taut by silence. Then, with no warning, her voice shifted lower, colder. You will not survive if I show you what I am. The sentence didn't echo. It landed like a weight. It wasn't a threat, it was prophecy. And still, Elias smiled. It wasn't bravado, it wasn't madness, it was resignation and something more. Something warmer than defiance. Then let me die seeing you honestly. The breeze stopped, the planet stilled. Seraphine didn't move, but her light dimmed, or maybe it withdrew, drawing into herself like a wave just before the crash. Her glowing irises narrowed, faint cracks of uncertainty appearing at the edges of her flawless composure. Why? She asked. His smile faded, not from fear, but from the gravity of truth. Because I've killed things I never knew, fought creatures I was ordered to hate, but I've never truly seen what we're fighting. Maybe that's why this war never ends. Maybe that's why we never end. She watched him for a long moment, a silence filled with unspoken tragedies. She saw the scars on his body, yes, but also the ones he carried deeper graves in his memory, faces in his sleep, regrets etched in the corners of his mouth. And what startled her more was how he saw her. Not as a weapon, not as a monster, not even as a legend. Just someone. I was not made to be loved, she said. Elias shrugged. Neither was I. That didn't stop anyone from trying. He reached forward not to attack, but simply to touch the air between them. He stopped just inches from her shoulder, hand trembling. Not from pain, from something else. Anticipation, reverence, hope. Seraphine's breath caught. She hadn't expected that. They had called her a god of annihilation. She had watched worlds break under her wings. Yet here stood a man broken and bleeding, asking for nothing but truth, not survival, not victory, not even forgiveness, just the truth. And for the first time in what might have been centuries, her defenses faltered. "You should fear me," she whispered, softer now. "I do," he said, "but I fear the lie more." That struck something deep, too deep. She turned her head slightly, as if to hide the flicker in her gaze. But it was too late. Elias had seen it. Not rage, not violence, but grief. Grief so old it had calcified into myth. Grief that had become armor. She stepped back, just once. A single shift of weight, but it cracked something between theme and invisible wall, now trembling, brittle. She looked at him one last time in that borrowed form, and for the first time, she wasn't alone. She stood still for a moment too long, and the world held its breath with her. The sky above flickered, as if reality itself strained to accommodate what was about to unfold. There was no music, no signal, just a quiet, deliberate stillness that settled into Elias's bones. His heart slowed. The ache in his chest vanished beneath something heavier, an instinctive awareness that the universe was about to change. Seraphine's gaze didn't break from his, but her edges softened. Not in gentleness, but in structure. Her body, once shaped like a woman cloaked in starlight, began to blur, the boundaries of flesh and illusion dissolving like smoke and oil. Her feet no longer touched the ground. They drifted, lifted, not flying, ascending. And then, it began. Her skin, if it could be called that, shimmered like obsidian kissed by lightning. Cracks of bioluminescent silver broke across her limbs, not wounds, but veins pulsing with ancient power. The shimmer spread, blooming outward like a flower of flame. Her spine arched back, and from her shoulders erupted, wings not feathered, not mechanical, but fluid, like woven fire, suspended in the shape of grace. Each motion sent silent ripples into the air, distorting the light like heat above desert stone. Elias didn't move. He should have run. Every part of him screamed to turn away, but he couldn't. Not from her, not from this. Her face unraveled next not in gore, but revelation. Her eyes expanded into orbs of cosmic depth, twin galaxies spinning behind translucent lids, galaxies filled not with stars but with memory, grief, wonder, rage, forgiveness. It was like staring directly into the center of time, and it stared back. Her mouth no longer formed words, but her voice still reached him, not as sound but as a vibration through his bones, a whisper that echoed through marrow and blood. 1,000 voices spoke as one. They sang not a melody, but a resonance, a hum that filled the air with the texture of memory. Elias felt it press against his skin like a warm tide, tasted iron and salt on his tongue, smelled rain on scorched stone. She wasn't just becoming herself, she was becoming truth. And still, he did not die. His mind did not fracture. His lungs did not seize. He didn't fall to the ground screaming like the others had, like the record said they would. He remained. He looked at her, really looked, and for a moment, he forgot the war, forgot the screaming of dying friends, the burnt faces in the mud, the commands shouted through static. All that was gone. Erased by what stood before him, this radiant, terrible, impossibly real being who had once worn a face that looked human. His breath caught in his throat, and when the moment allowed him, he whispered not with fear, but with awe. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." She froze. Not because she didn't hear him, but because she did. The space around her dimmed, as if the glow of her body pulsed inward, trying to make sense of something that logic refused to accept. She'd heard screams before, cries, pleas, worship, curses, but never this. Never that word. Never beautiful. Her wings curled slightly inward, her body still glowing, still Vaseline just enough for Elias to see it. The trembling of her aura, the fracture behind her gaze. "No one has ever said that to me," she said, or thought, or sang. Whatever form her voice took now, it shook. Elias took a breath. "I mean it." And he did. Not because she was soft or delicate. She was neither. She was terrible, in the old sense of the word. The kind of terrible that inspired holy texts. The kind of beauty that bent nations. She was not a dream. She was the waking. She stepped closer, each movement slow, fluid, unbound by gravity. Her wings shimmered behind her like silent storms, their currents rippling the ground beneath his knees. Still, he didn't cower. His body ached with the weight of what he was witnessing, but something deeper held him still. "You should have perished," she said. "But I didn't. That frightens me." "Why?" "Because if you can see me and live, then perhaps I am not the monster I believed." He felt the words like truth carved into stone. For centuries, millennia she had existed as a weapon, a myth, a shadow stitched into the nightmares of entire civilizations. No one dared look. No one ever returned to speak of her shape. Not because she was cruel, but because the truth of her was too vast for minds born of time to hold. And now, one soldier did. Not because he was stronger, but because he chose not to fear her. She lowered herself slowly until her massive wings folded behind her, their heat finally dimming into silence. She knelt before him, not out of reverence but out of vulnerability. This wasn't surrender. It was understanding. He could see it now, not the power, but the loneliness. In all her forms, no one had ever stayed. But he had, and that changed everything. She dropped to her knees, not like a queen surrendering, but like a temple collapsing beneath the weight of its own legend. Her wings, those vast, radiant things, folded inward as if ashamed of themselves. Light recoiled, power recoiled. Even the stars above seemed to dim in empathy or fear. Her breath, if she still had breath, shuddered from her lips like fog from fractured stone. The ground beneath her cracked softly, as though the world itself strained to contain what was unraveling inside her. She looked at him, not with divinity, not with superiority, but with a terrible, quiet disbelief. "No one," she said, "has ever lived past this moment. Why do you?" Elias didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. His silence carried weight. It was not arrogance, it was reverence. His gaze, steady but not defiant, met hers like a man looking into the edge of the void and deciding not to step back. He swallowed, voice low. "Maybe I wasn't afraid to understand." Her head tilted slightly, as if the sentence had touched something buried too deep to name. Her gaze flickered, twin galaxies dimming, as if memory was reawakening behind them. And then the first fracture appeared, not in her armor, not in her form, but behind her expression, a shadow. Not physical, something older, and the world fell away. Without warning, the space around them melted into memory. Time rippled sideways, pulling Elias into a vision not his own, as if her pain had grown so loud it could no longer stay quiet. He saw them, her people, the Valerital and luminous, woven from starlight and spirit, once revered by lesser civilizations as the architects of cosmic harmony. They did not invade. They were not conquerors. They were keepers of balance. Until the first empire came, iron ships rained from the stars. The Violari, peaceful and unprepared, were torn from the skies. He saw them caged in anti-energy fields, dissected by scientists who didn't understand what they were peeling apart. He saw young Valari children forced into containment pods too small to stand in. And Serafin Yonsei, another name. Once someone soft, stripped of voice, identity, everything that had once made her a daughter, a friend, a lover. He saw him, a figure made of memory and warmth, a Valari male, eyes like dusk, voice like rain. The one she had chosen. He saw him burn from the air in a blast of white phosphorus launched from a human skyship, screaming her name as his form crumbled into radiant ash. Not in battle, in retreat, in mercy. Seraphine had fallen to the ground then, just like now. But they didn't let her stay broken. They rebuilt her, not to heal but to weaponize. They replaced her elegance with precision, her wonder with protocol. Her body, once sacred, was reforged into something terrible. Wings calibrated for sonic collapse, heart encased in quantum steel. She was no longer a person. She was a deterrent, a myth made flesh. And yet nowhere, in this silence between broken empires and crumbling starsa, human reached out. He didn't flinch, didn't kneel in worship, didn't look away. His hand moved slow, deliberate, calloused from years of war. He placed it gently against her cheek, where light still shimmered, flickering like flame caught in glass. It wasn't dominance. It wasn't pity. It was something far more dangerous. Tenderness. Her eyes widened. No systems activated. No alerts triggered. No defense protocol surged. Just stillness. And in that stillness, she trembled. Her voice, when it returned, cracked like frozen crystal. "I was told you were monsters," she said. "I was told you weren't people," Elias whispered. "They made me forget I was alive. They made me forget how to feel." The two stared at each other, and in the vast distance between them, generations of bloodshed began to bleed into something else. Not forgiveness. That was too easy. Too clean. What passed between them now was Messiera, unpolished. The aching echo of shared suffering. "I once had a name," she said, barely audible. "What was it?" She closed her eyes. For a moment, the fire behind them dimmed entirely. "I don't remember." "I'll remember for you," he answered, without hesitation. The words weren't grand, they weren't meant to be, but they broke her anyway. Her body shook not from fear but from release, as if millennia of silence had finally found a crack to escape through. For the first time in her existence as a weapon, she leaned forward not to attack, but to be held. Just briefly. Just long enough to know what it felt like to be touched without intention, to be seen without distortion. Elias wrapped his arm around her shoulder, not fully, not easily. She was still vast, still radiant, but it was enough. And somewhere in the deep, ancient corners of her soul, something began to rebuild. Not armor, not weapons, something else. Something human. Something hopeful. Something forbidden, but no longer impossible. It began as a whisper, drifting between broken satellites and silent hulls. First, it was dismissed a glitch, a fable, battlefield madness. But whispers are patient things. They nest in static, ride encrypted bursts of old emergency channels, and take root in doubt, and doubt spreads faster than fire in a sealed ship. A human had touched an ascendant's final form and lived. No melting of the mind, no collapse of spirit, no system overload, just flesh and breath and stillness. Some called it treason, others a miracle. And while command logs were wiped and officers sworn to silence, the story bloomed anyway, hushed between soldiers huddled in deep burrow bunkers, traded in fragments between refugee fleets, murmured like heresy across alien shrines long untouched by sunlight. Entire front lines froze. Missiles never launched. Orders delayed without explanation. Admirals demanded answers in rooms sealed against leaks, and none were given. Officially, Elias Ward was dead. Lost in a forward operation. No remains, no commendation, no closure. Unofficially, he was everything. A symbol, a lie, a question no one wanted to ask aloud. And while the galaxy reeled from a story it could neither believe nor fully deny, the man and the goddess stood beneath a fractured sky where clouds rippled like bruised glass, and dying stars flickered through cracked atmosphere like old ghosts. They were alone, but not unseen. Satellites above them spun slower, as if listening. Ancient orbital lenses, long abandoned, began to stir, pulled from hibernation by frequencies never meant to be activated again. Elias looked up, breath shallow in the frost-laced air. His uniform hung in tatters. His hands, bruised and red, still carried the warmth of where he had touched her. He wasn't sure what had changed inside him, only that something had. She stood beside him, not in disguise, not hidden. Her final form glowed faintly, restrained now, wings folded against the storm, but the stars still hummed around her. Her light bent gravity. Her silence echoed louder than any war drum. He asked her quietly, "Do you want the war to end?" She didn't speak right away. The wind pulled at her flames, and her body shimmered, not just in light but in thought. When she turned to him, her gaze was unreadable, like starlight refracted through tears. "I want to remember what it feels like," she said, "to be someone's hope again." He looked at her, and something broke loose inside his chest, not pain, not desire. Recognition, like two fractured pieces of the same puzzle finding each other in a pile of ash and ruin. "You still are," he said. She flinched. A small thing, but real. For centuries, she had been a warning etched into doctrine. Do not approach, do not gaze, do not speak. She had been silence forged into violence. A myth built to end resistance before it began. And now here stood the impossible. A man not just standing beside her but believing in her. The galaxy noticed. Some watched with terror, whispering of forbidden prophecy, that an ascendant would fall, that a human would rise, that together they would unravel everything. Others watched with hope, because if Seraphine, the flame-born warden of extinction, could speak peace with a mortal, then maybe, just maybe, the gods could be reasoned with after all. In the shadows of power, fear fermented. The imperial primacy declared Elias a false idol. Fanatics burned his name into data cores, marking him as a disease. Religious zealots, blinded by dogma, called for his extermination. They offered rewards not for his head but for proof his mind had shattered, for validation that the myth could not be real. But it was. And it was growing. Across mining moons, forgotten outposts, prison ships in the dark, soldiers began to pause before firing. Messages were sent, coordinates exchanged, secret truces whispered into cracked comms. The old systems built on fear and fire had begun to splinter. In a chamber beneath the crust of a dead moon, two spies met under forged identities. One human, one Veilari. They didn't speak the same language. They didn't need to. They both carried an image, Elias touching the goddess's cheek, and her not turning away. Something had changed. Not just between species, not just between enemies, but within the idea of what war even meant anymore. In the stillness between stars, Seraphine lowered her wings and stepped closer. The glow in her chest pulsed softer now, like the rhythm of an old lullaby. Her fingers brushed against Elias's shoulder, not as a goddess, not as a symbol, but as someone who wanted to remember what touch meant, what trust meant. "Will they come for us?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Will we run?" "Number." He nodded. There was no triumph in his eyes, no rebellion, just acceptance. "We'll stand here then," he said, "as long as it takes." Her lips moved, not quite a smile, not quite a frown, something ancient, something sacred. And above them, the shattered sky began to mend just a little. It wasn't the killers that terrified them, it was the healers. Two figures, moving like ghosts across broken starfields, through abandoned trenches that still reeked of plasma and blood. No flags, no weapons. Just Elias, still marked by war, still walking with a limp that never quite healed, and Seraphine, her light now dimmed beneath a veil, a goddess dressed in silence. They were not fugitives, not saints. They were something worse. They were proof. Word had spread like fire in a dry cathedral. The Ascendant had spared a human, and worse still, he had touched her. Not in battle, not in conquest, but in a gesture so soft it shattered generations of fear. Empires could endure explosions. They could not endure ideas. So the world turned on them. Not all at once, but in pieces. First came the Watchers, eyes hidden behind mirrored helmets, silent drones orbiting too close, names scrubbed from records. Then the Whisperous alliances withdrawn, communications scrambled, safe routes sealed behind bureaucratic static. Their allies grew quiet, then cold, then gone. But they kept walking. Across shattered moons where gravity stuttered like a dying heartbeat, they met with broken generals and rebel clerics. Across crater cities where children played in the skeletons of downed ships, they spoke with elders who remembered stars before they burned. Seraphine never raised her voice. Elias never raised a weapon. But with every step, every breath, every moment they stood beside each other, they unraveled the lie that kept the war alive. The lie that some beings were born to destroy and others to fear. That some truths could not be survived. And so both sides sent assassins. Some came cloaked in mercy, smiling, hands outstretched, voices soft as betrayal. Some came cloaked in armor, armed with celestial steel, designed to silence gods. But none of them succeeded. Not because Elias and Seraphine were invincible, but because in every place where someone tried to kill them, someone else tried to protect them. A child once threw herself in front of a sniper's scope. A former inquisitor detonated his own transport just to give them 5 more minutes. And still, they walked. And still, they burned. Until one day, the war tried to stop them for good. The location meant nothing. Just another barren world with too much dust and too little sky. The air choked with old ash. 2 armies faced each other across a scarred valley, human on one side, Veilari on the other, each poised for annihilation. Elias and Seraphine stood between them. She had warned him this would happen. They would come not to speak, but to erase. To cleanse history before it grew teeth. Behind him, missiles hummed in their launchers. Guns locked into spinal ports. Heat signatures painted the air in colors only machines could see. Ahead, the alien dreadwalkers stood 5 stories high, their minds tethered to flame. No diplomacy now. No one wanted words. Just a reset. And that was when she stepped forward. Not as a shadow, not in disguise, but as herself. Her final form returned not with violence, but with radiance. Her wings unfurled, slow and burning. Her skin shimmered like obsidian, stitched with thunder. Her eyes, twin novas, caught the gaze of every soldier and didn't let go. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The truth of her presence ruptured the moment like glass under gravity. And then Elias moved beside her. He was unarmed, bare-chested, blood on his shoulder, eyes clear, mortal, fragile, and yet unshaken. He reached up, slowly, and placed his hand over his heart. No speech, no declaration. Just that, and something happened that had never happened before. The gun sewn by one lowered, not because they were ordered, but because no one wanted to fire first, not at her, not at him, not at what they represented. 2 beings own born from stars, the other from soil standing, side by side, not in conquest, not in fear, but in defiance of the war that built them. A general dropped her rifle. A Veilari war mind collapsed into kneeling reverence. And for a heartbeat longer than most lives, the galaxy remembered what it meant to choose peace. That was the moment everything changed. Not with an explosion, but with stillness. Not all wars end with silence. Some echo for generations. Years passed, though time didn't feel linear anymore. It folded and stretched around the scars left behind, like old wounds learning how to breathe beneath new skin. The maps were redrawn, but the memories remained etched into the soil, carved into the hearts of survivors who no longer knew who the enemy had been. Peace came slowly, not as a triumph, but as a question. Treaties were signed with hands that once pulled triggers. Entire languages were relearned just to say I'm sorry with precision. And even as the guns cooled and the warships turned to rust, the galaxy watched them, those 2 Elias and Seraphine, walking through halls that had once debated annihilation, now speaking of something far more difficult than victory: coexistence. The United Coalition Senate had been rebuilt atop the ruins of the old Marton Spire, where the ashes of 10 billion dead whispered through the glass. The chamber was circular now, no longer tiered by rank, and the air shimmered faintly with bioluminescent runes, Veilari craftsmanship reminders that beauty could rise even from the bones of hatred. Seraphine stood at the center. Her form was stable humanoid, yet not quite. Her eyes still held galaxies, though their light had softened. Her voice no longer bent metal when she spoke, but it still shook men to listen. Not from fear, never again from fear, but because it carried truth. And truth, when unmasked, is the loudest force in the room. Elias sat behind her. Older, wiser, still limping, still scarred, but with a calm that only those who had faced extinction and chosen love could wear like armor. He didn't speak often in these chambers. He didn't have to. His presence spoke louder than the agendas scrolling across the walls in holographic ribbons. When she said the words, the room held still. "We feared what we didn't understand," Seraphine said. "We cloaked ourselves in stories, called each other monsters, drew borders around pain and labeled it survival." Eyes across the chamber blinked slowly, many unaccustomed to feeling anything but protocol. She continued, "But sometimes, it only takes one soul brave enough to truly look without judgment." Somewhere in the gallery, a Terran ambassador lowered his gaze. A Veilari priest touched her chest, where once a core of violence had lived. One by one, even the most cynical of them felt it. Not persuasion, not politics. Resonance. They had introduced a new practice, now something once forbidden in the old world. They called it the sight ritual. It began as a symbolic act, a diplomat from each species stepping forward, removing any technology that masked scent, posture, voice, or emotion. No translator fields, no psychic dampeners, no adaptive clothing. For a moment, raw and honest, they stood vulnerable in their truth, And in that fragile pause, they simply looked at each other. For some, it was unbearable. They saw echoes of conquered worlds, generational guilt, grief passed down like heirlooms. But for others it opened something no treaty could: empathy. There was a scene once unrecorded, never broadcast, when a high-ranking general broke down weeping mid-ritual. He had stared into the eyes of a former Valari commando whose battalion he had wiped out 30 years prior. She said nothing, just stood there, breathing, human. The general stepped forward and hugged her. No words, no audience clapped. But afterward, 3 war zones de-escalated in under a week. Change had no anthem. It came in these small, unscripted moments. Seraphine and Elias never claimed leadership. They didn't sit on thrones or sculpt ideologies. They just showed up. They moved through embassies like travelers, not rulers. In backrooms, they broke bread with those who'd once issued kill orders against them. They listened, they taught, and most importantly, they stayed. Despite threats, despite sabotage within sabotage plots spun from those terrified of what their union meant. Because if an ascendant could love a human, then maybe the old mythologies, the ones that kept worlds apart, had always been a lie. There was one night, late into the cycle, when Elias stood alone on a terrace overlooking the rebuilt Senate. Below, delegates moved like shifting constellations beneath pale lantern light. The breeze was warm, quiet. Seraphine joined him without a word. He didn't turn. He just said softly, "Do you think they understand now?" She placed her hand over his. "No," she said, "but they're trying." And somehow, in a galaxy that had burned itself hollow chasing control, trying was enough to rebuild stars. There are some silences that feel like endings. Others feel like beginnings. Night had fallen in layers over the embassy, wrapping the structure in soft shadows and gold-lit glass. The Earth Violari compound rose like a dream carved from bone and memory-curved walls that shimmered with starstone veins, a fusion of ancient alien geometry and human utility. It breathed, in a way, alive with warmth and watchfulness. And on the uppermost balcony, just beyond the hush of diplomatic routines and political residue, Elias stood alone beneath the stars. He leaned against the rail, eyes tracing constellations he used to know by name, now rewritten by proximity to a new sky. The night air was quiet, not silent, but respectful, like even the wind knew it was intruding on something sacred. His hands were calloused, his knuckles scarred, and the faint silver in his beard had crept in without permission. He heard her before he saw her. No footfall, no sound, just a soft change in gravity, as if the air thickened in awe of her presence. She emerged beside him like dusk wrapped in starlight. No disguise now, no hiding. Her true form unfolded in the open air, slow and unthreatening. Her skin shimmered in ribbons of violet and obsidian, her outline fluid and majestic, woven with light from galaxies long dead, wings folded behind her not for flight, but remembrance. She wasn't glowing for show, she simply was. He glanced at her, tired but steady. "You never told me," he said quietly, "why I lived." Her gaze lingered on him, not with power, but softness. "For centuries," she said, "the moment a soul saw me for what I truly was, their minds shattered, their body rebelled, their heart collapsed beneath the weight of truth." She looked upward, eyes reflecting the cosmos like water reflects fire. "But when you looked at me, you didn't see a god." He didn't respond. "You didn't worship," she continued. "You didn't fear. You didn't even flinch." She turned fully now, facing him, her voice lowering to something sacred. "You looked at me like I was someone, just someone who needed to be seen." The stars above didn't blink, the sky didn't move, but something in the space between them did, like old wounds, loosening their grip. He exhaled through his nose, something unreadable in his eyes. Tired love, quiet defiance. A man who had walked through death, only to find life waiting in the ruins. Seraphine stepped closer. The radiant heat from her presence brushed against his skin, not burning, but warm, like a memory long buried. Her height towered, her aura vast. But in that moment, she seemed small in the most human of ways. She lowered her head, gently touching her cosmic forehead to his. And in the pause that followed, nothing else in the universe dared make a sound. No missiles launched, no alarm screamed, no broadcasts interrupted. Just one truth too raw for history books and too fragile for politics, whispered between two breathing souls beneath a sky that had once burned. She said peace didn't begin when the war ended. It began when someone chose to understand the unbearable truth and stayed. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. He raised his hand, slow and reverent, and rested it over her Salian, ancient, alive. And in that moment, there were no more borders, no more species, no more legend. Just the pulse of two beings who had chosen not to run. And as their silhouettes melted into the starlight, the voice returned, not hers, not his, but the voice that had told their story from the beginning, now finally allowed to speak its last. In a galaxy built on fear, one gaze born of courage changed everything. She was supposed to be untouchable. He was supposed to be disposable. Yet together, they rewrote the language of war, with silence, truth, and the courage to stay. Where empires failed, a simple gaze endured. Where fear reigned for generations, one act of mercy fractured it all. He didn't slay the monster. He saw her. And in a galaxy that fed on division, they became the myth. No one could kill because it was no longer a weapon. It was a memory, passed from star to star. But if one human could survive the impossible, what else have they lied to us about? This is only the beginning. More truths, more encounters, more stories they never wanted you to hear are waiting in the shadows of the stars. Subscribe to Alien Chronicles. Because out there, beyond the veil, the next truth is already watching you back.